Hey everyone, welcome to another exciting video where I'm going to stain the top of this dresser. And as you can see, it's faded in this corner here. The finish is worn off and that wood has dried out. And that's not a big deal really. So let's get to it. So just getting started here, I'm going to get these drawers out and get the old hardware off. And I always reuse the old holes so I don't have to drill new ones. So I've already ordered the hardware for this, and I'm going to just take this hardware off and tape over those holes so I don't get spray down in there. Since I've turned this into a business, I've looked for ways to cut down on time, and reusing the old holes saves about 2 hours of time. And that adds up because I don't want to spend any longer than 8 hours on a dresser. And if I have to drill new holes, that puts me up around 10 hours, and that's too much for me. So now I've got, this happens a lot on a lot of these older dressers. You'll have these decorative pieces in the centers of the drawers. Some of these are nailed on and some can be screwed on. These happen to be nailed on. So I'm using a 5-way here to pop those off, and I'm going to circle those with a Sharpie so I know to fill those in with Bondo, and that's what we're doing here. So I don't need much, I'm not filling in the holes, I'm just filling in those nail holes from those decorative pieces there. So this is actually too much, but it's whatever. And that's all the hardener you need for that amount. And then you start mixing it up, and you want to make sure it's consistent, the same color throughout. And now the clock's ticking. You've got about 5 minutes to use that before it tacks up to the level where it basically doesn't spread anymore. And then it's going to be dried completely in 15-20 minutes. So you really don't have much time to work. And when you put this on, just go heavy with it, because a lot of times Bondo will shrink, and if it does that, then you got to do it again. So make sure you leave that Bondo a little proud, and you can always sand it down. So while that's drying, I'm going to wrap up these drawers. This is the way I do it. I'm sure there's a lot of other ways to do it, but this was the way that I found the fastest. So lay your paper out, put the drawer in it, wrap the paper around, you're just going to cut it and tape it. Every now and then it's nice you get a drawer that has a clear ridge to apply your tape to. Sometimes it gets tricky when it doesn't have that. Now we're going to hit this with some 120 grit, and we're not really looking to get this down to bare wood per se. We're really looking to get those old hardware marks out of the middle of that drawer there. Back when they made this dresser, they put those handles on while the lacquer was still soft. So now whenever you take that old hardware off, you see impressions left behind. And you have to get those impressions out because they will show through even with, a coat of primer, 2 coats of paint. it doesn't matter. You still see those impressions. So I'm mostly focusing on the center of this drawer and not so much on the outsides unless there's nicks and scratches that need to come out. Otherwise, you just take your 120 and focus it towards that center there and try to get that old hardware mark out. I suppose if you're reusing the hardware, you may not have to do this, but I always get new hardware when I refinish, so I have to get these out. So I'm going to do this with all of them. I'm going to hit them with 120, and usually 120 is what you use to get all your material off that you want to get off. And then after this, I'm going to hit all of these with 220 to soften them up a little bit. And those are the only two grits I use when I'm doing dressers. I have 120 and 220, and that's it. I think I have some 100 for some other projects, but 120 and 220 is really all you need. Now I'm going to sand that Bondo, and the way I found the best way to do it is hold the sander down on top of it and start it up, and that will smooth out that Bondo to the level that you can run your sander over it like this here. In my experience, if you try to come in from the side, your sander will almost act like a saw blade, and it will chip that Bondo off. And if you've got holes that are a decent sized hole, like a hardware hole, when you chip that Bondo off, usually it will pull the Bondo out of that hole, and then you got to refill it. And so I found that if you just sand the top of that Bondo, it smooths it out to where you can run your sander over it. And here I'm using 220 just to smooth it out. Just go over it a couple times. You use 120 to hog off material, so you're just going to use 220 to smooth everything out. And now I'm running over all of these drawers with a tack cloth, and in my other hand I've got a wiping cloth, so I will hit it with a tack cloth. That pulls off a decent amount of material, and then I go over it with that wiping cloth, and then I actually, before I do this part, I get my air gun and I spray it even more. So I try to hit it with a few cloths and some air before I spray on it. And even this spray gun that I'm using, these came from Harbor Freight, and they do pretty good. But if you barely squeeze the trigger, it just shoots air out, and you can use that to spray dust off also. And I'm just using primer here to get things started. While I'm doing this primer, I'm working on the dresser simultaneously. So that's how I keep the process going. So I'm not stuck at a certain point, waiting on something. I've turned this into a business, and it started off as a side hustle, and now it's a full-time gig, and I've looked for ways to make it as efficient as possible. So I usually get these drawers started first, and while they're drying, I work on the dresser, and while that's drying or something, I'm doing work on these drawers here. So I'm constantly keeping the process moving, and I can get a dresser done in 2 days. So now the drawers are drying, and I'm working on stripping the top here. What's nice about that primer is it only takes maybe an hour to dry. So I'm thinking by the time I'm done stripping this and wiping it down, I think the drawers were ready for the first coat of paint after that. So it's another benefit to that primer that I like. It dries quick and it works really well. But right now I'm working on stripping the top, and I'm just using an old chip brush to spread this stuff around. And You want to make this a pretty thick coat. It does tend to dry out if you have a thin coat, so you want it thick. I know this stuff is not cheap, but it if you go with a thin coat, it's going to dry out, and then you got to do a second coat anyway. So you might as well just go with a thick coat right away and just spread it around. And it really doesn't take long. I usually wait maybe 5 minutes at the most, and then it's ready. So I just use a chip brush. I make sure it's spread evenly. The center is where a lot of it goes, so I'm pulling some of that to the edges. Those are the tricky parts. I usually end up leaving a lot of finish on those edges. So I'm pulling it over. I'm going to get the trim also. So now it's been a couple minutes, maybe 5 minutes. I'm not sure exactly, but I do a little corner test, and if I see it come off pretty easy, then I know it's ready to go. So I've just got a dustpan and a scraper, and I'm just going to scrape this off very gently. You don't want your scraper to be at a sharp angle and dig in, so you got to learn where the angle is, the sweet spot for how to get this off, because some of that stripper comes off really well, like towards the center. Towards the edges, it's a little trickier, and I'll show you that. So you just got to learn the angle at the best angle to pull that off. And I always strip the tops. I know there's people out there that will scrape the tops off, but I tried that once and I tore the top up, so I said never again. So now I strip the tops just like this every time, and it really reduces the number of scratches I got to try to sand out. And since we're working with veneer, you really want to reduce the amount of sanding that you're doing on the top. So this finish right here that I'm scraping off, you would much rather scrape this off than try to sand it off, because edges get tore up very easily when you're sanding tops like this. And this is veneer, and I don't know how thick the veneer is, so you just have to treat it as if it's very thin veneer, and you just really want to reduce the amount of sanding on the top. You want to get as much scraped off as you can before you go to sanding. And now for that trim, I'm just using a grout brush to get this off the trim here. The trim is solid wood, so if you don't get all of that finish off and you have to sand, a decent amount, that's okay. You don't want to sand too much, but usually the trim is a solid piece of wood, so it's a little more forgiving with a sander. The tops are not. Most of the tops I deal with are veneer, and you don't know how thin they are or how old they are, so you want to reduce the amount of sanding on the top. So we scraped it off. Now I'm going to use mineral spirits to soak this thing down. You want to neutralize the stripping agent so you don't have problems later. So I just slop it on and wipe everything down real good, and then I wipe off the excess with a dry rag. So now that's drying, so I'm back in the spray booth. I'm working on these drawers here, getting the first coat of paint on. This paint is a light beige. My wife really prefers to use a lighter neutral color for the paint, and that allows us to pretty much have unlimited options with staining the tops. And we really specialize in that two-tone look, so Having a lighter paint works better because then we can do whatever stain color we want for the top. If you have a dark paint, then you have to pretty much do a light stain or no stain at all and just have natural wood. If you have dark paint and dark stain, it just doesn't work. So I'm just spraying this on here. You can't really tell a whole lot of difference. I mean, the primer is a true white and the paint is a little bit darker than that. It's got a little bit of a yellowish hue, but it's going to be hard to see from the video. But I'm going to put 2 coats of paint on, and then I'm going to move to lacquer. So now I'm going to start sanding this, and I'm using some 220 grit, I believe, on this sander. And here's how you can tell it's veneer. You can see the wood grain is going opposite each other. And that's a telltale sign that this top is probably a piece of plywood or a piece of particle board with veneer on the top. And then the trim is going the opposite direction, so it's a piece of trim to cover up, whatever that top is. So I'm just hitting these with 220. It's coming off pretty easily. If I was having a hard time getting that off, I would have switched to 120. But this was coming off, so I just kept it at 220. Now I'm using a sanding block. It's just a piece of wood that I cut and sanded off a little bit to make it easier to use, but it's got a 90-degree angle on it, so I just put a piece of sandpaper on it to brush up against that edge there to get all of that out. The sander does a pretty good job, but it won't get in the corners like that. Now I'm just going to take a sanding pad and some 220. So I guess I was using 120 earlier. I don't know. I think I was still using 220. That sander takes off a little more material than you really want. So I keep the sander moving quickly, but you still want to use a sanding pad afterwards to smooth it out. Now we're moving on to the most important process, and that is sanding the top. And this can make or break your whole project if you do this wrong. So I don't use a real coarse grit. I use a 120 grit to get started, and it takes a little bit longer, but I've tried to use a lower grit to get it done faster, and it usually doesn't go well. So I use 120. It takes a little bit longer, but it takes material off without taking too much off, and I feel like I have more control over it. So I'm going to use 120 at first, and then I will use 220 to smooth it out later on in the process. And usually it takes about an hour to sand a top, so it does take a while to do. And, if you have music or something, it helps, but I know some people can get bored with sanding, but you have to do it. Fortunately for you, the viewer, we don't have to sit here and watch the whole hour. Now I'm going to show you how to sand these edges. You really want to be careful and keep your sander moving at all times. You don't want to sit in one spot. And it's because these sanders are not perfectly flat. They're a little bit concave. And so the sandpaper will actually fold over your edge, and it has the tendency to chip away at the edges of your veneer. So you want to move quickly, and you want to move consistently, and you don't want to stay in one spot. You want to keep your sander going. So here, this area here that I've marked is where that finish had faded out and dried out the wood. And when I first saw this after stripping, I really wasn't alarmed by this because I see this often and it usually does come out. Especially later on, I'm going to use conditioner, and once the conditioner goes in there, it rehydrates that dry spot and you won't even notice it later on. So I'm going through about maybe 5 sheets of 120. Once you feel that your sandpaper really isn't biting in, then it's time to change it out. So by now I've gotten pretty much the look that I'm wanting. And now here I'm hitting it with some 220. And that's the speed I go. I'm not trying to fly through the 220. Since I've used 120 and I haven't seen any chipping or sanding through the veneer, then I felt like this might have been a wood-backed veneer, which is much more durable than a paper-backed. So if it's wood-backed, it has a little more toughness to it, and I didn't get any damage while I was sanding with 120, so I was able to go over this a couple more times with 220 than I usually would. So I wiped it off with a dry rag, get that dust off, and now I'm going to condition this. And I've done dressers with conditioner and I've done them without conditioner, and I highly recommend the conditioner. Sometimes you get lucky. I've done dressers where I got lucky and everything turned out without the conditioner, but I've had some where I forgot the conditioner or I didn't use it at all, for whatever reason, and it turned out blotchy. And once a dresser turns out blotchy, there really is no fixing it. You can't just keep staining that spot over and over because that spot will always be darker than the rest of the dresser. And you can't sand it. It looks unnatural. It looks like you intentionally messed with it. So once your dresser comes out blotchy, you just have to strip it and try to sand it all over again and hope that you don't go through the veneer. So since I'm trying to reduce as much sanding as possible on those tops, I always use a conditioner because it does limit the capacity of the wood to soak up stain. However, it does make it more even. So I wipe that conditioner on, and then I wipe off the excess with a dry rag, and then I give it about an hour to dry. I've heard if you wait longer, it causes problems, so I haven't had any. I just wait an hour and then I start staining. So here we're going with dark walnut, which is my personal favorite. It's dark, but it has a slight reddish hue to it, and I think that looks really good on oak. And I like to use a rag instead of a brush. So I take a clean rag and I wad it up into a ball, and then I spread it on evenly over the whole top. So just get you a nice helping right there and go with the wood grain and make sure you cover the top evenly and make sure that you don't leave those swirls in. I'm going to get the stain on, and then towards the end I will straighten everything out and go with the wood grain. And you can let it sit for a few minutes if you want. I usually just wipe on and wipe off because I would rather build thin layers of stain instead of trying to get it all at once, because if you leave this on for a long time, it dries out and it smears when you try to wipe it off, and it just doesn't look good. So it's a lot easier to get the color you want when you just wipe on and wipe off right away, and then you just build layers on top of that. So it's been maybe a minute, I'm not sure exactly, a minute or two, and now I'm going to wipe off. So I'm using a clean rag, and I'm going to get the trim first because the trim will soak up more than the top. So if you stain the trim first and then the top, that's going to end up darker. So I do the top, then I do the trim, and then when I'm wiping off, I wipe the trim first. Because the top is face grain, your trim is side or end grain, and those always soak up more stain. And if you want your trim to look darker than the top, you can do that. I just prefer everything to be consistent. So now as I'm wiping off, I have not flipped that rag over. I'm still using one side, and I'm doing two things. One, I'm kind of taking off excess, and two, I'm leaving a little bit on there. So while I'm wiping, I'm kind of massaging that into the wood also at the top. So now at this point I'm using the other side of the rag, and it's still not getting all of it off. So I'm just going to run this dirty rag over it a few more times, and then I'm going to get a clean rag and wipe off all of the excess. Now this is where I strike off. So I take that rag and I tuck it in between my fingers, and I'm going to make one pass across the top, and that's it. One final pass going with the wood grain, going straight, perfectly straight across. It's very easy when you first start this to make rainbows, and you don't want to do the rainbow. You want to go perfectly straight across with the wood grain. So if there are any streaks, they will blend in with the wood grain, and it will be very hard for someone to see it. And I think I did this late at night, so I decided to let it dry overnight. And it's the next day, getting things started. And looking at it now, that spot that I marked is where that faded finish was, and you can't hardly tell it was there. And I like this color that's on here, but it wasn't quite as dark as I was hoping, so I'm going to use the last of this can and try to darken this top a little bit more. A lot of times with this varathane stain, I can pretty much get the color I want in one coat, but every now and then you'll run into a top that just doesn't want to soak up stain. And that's just a common thing that I run into every now and then. Some tops will soak up a lot more stain than you expect, and they turn out darker than you want. And some, like this one, don't really soak up very much at all. So it really just depends on what you end up with, what kind of wood type, and what kind of veneer it is, or if it's a solid wood top. All that plays a factor into it. So I'm doing exactly what I did the first time, putting on the stain, using the dirty rag to wipe off, and then I'm going to use a clean rag to get everything else off. And then I'm going to strike off again. That's something you always want to do. And this stain does tend to darken over time. I've noticed that the color that I see now, an hour later, when it's pretty well dry, usually it does tend to darken a little bit more. So when I put this second coat on, I was hoping that it would eventually get to the color I wanted. And here's that spot that was dried out, and I don't even think you can see anything there. So I came back a little bit later. It still wasn't the color I wanted, so I'm using a different stain. It's called Kona, and this is a much darker brown, and it's a true brown. So the dark walnut has a slight reddish hue to it. This has no reddish hue. So at this point, I was putting this coat of stain on. I was hoping that I just needed one to get me the dark color I'm looking for, because I didn't want to put more of this stain on or it would cover up the dark walnut stain. And I could have stopped at the first coat of dark walnut and the second coat. I mean, there's really unlimited ways to do stain. You can make it as dark as you want, as light as you want. You can do whatever you want with it. And the first couple of coats look good, but it just wasn't what I envisioned for this piece. And that's why I'm putting this third coat of stain on. But if you had stopped at the first or second coat, that would have been a good idea too. Oak really looks good with just about any color stain. So when you look at stain colors in the store and they show you the different samples, that's usually oak that they're showing it on, because it's one of the prettiest woods. So I'm just doing the exact same thing as I've done before. Strike off, straight across. And at this point I was done. I didn't want to do another coat of Kona because I didn't want to cover up the reddish hue from the dark walnut. So this was it. I was just crossing my fingers and hoping that it was what I was looking for. So while that's drying, I've moved into the spray booth and I'm hitting these drawers with lacquer. And I do 2 coats of lacquer. So I'm not sure if this was the first or second coat, but I always do 2 coats of lacquer on these drawers and the sides and the body of the dresser. And then I'll do 3 coats of lacquer on the top of the dresser, just because it's a high traffic area. So now I'm going to cover the top with this paper here. And I've done it both ways, where I did the dresser first and then tried to stain the top, and then stain the top and then cover it, then take it to the spray booth and do the primer. And I feel like it does better this way. So I'm going to cover this top with some 12-inch paper and tape it off. And you want to tuck the paper down into the tape, because you don't want the tape to stick to your fresh stain on your top there. So I try to tuck the paper down into it. So I'm going to do both sides, the back and the top. I want to completely cover this thing, and you don't want any cracks, especially in those corners. Sometimes there's a crack and I'll find some spray up in there, and then I got to take a razor blade and scrape that off and restain it. And you just want to avoid all the little touch-ups if you can, because that adds time to the piece, and I don't want to spend any longer than 8 hours on a piece. So I'm trying to spend an extra 5 minutes taping and papering, so I'm not spending a couple hours cleaning up. And I'm going to show you a close-up here of what I'm looking for when I'm taping off. I want the tape to not touch the front of the dresser. These white marks here is the front. And if your tape goes down and touches those when you paint and you peel that tape off, you're going to see the previous finish that's on there. And now I'm shamelessly plugging my favorite primer of all time. I've tried a lot of primers, and a lot of them I have to do 2 and 3 coats, or they just don't work well with the paint, or they clog up my spray gun or something. But this primer is the best primer I've ever used, and I highly recommend it. It is a one spray and done. You don't have to worry about bleed through, and really on the can it says you can spray without sanding. I still sand, but it's still excellent either way. So I'm just going to prime this dresser, and it only takes like an hour for this primer to dry. It's another great thing, if you're looking for efficiency in your process. And, the sooner you get each process done, the sooner the whole dresser is done. Now that's drying. I'm going to hit these with 400 very lightly. I'm just knocking off any bumps that may have accumulated on there. Now we're getting to the new hardware. My wife picked these out. I think they look great. We've used them before on a lot of other dressers. I do this full time, so she orders all the hardware for us. And when the customer gives us good feedback on a particular style, we tend to go with that more often. So I've got all the hardware on those drawers, and now I'm moving to painting the sides and the body of this dresser. So I'm going to do 1 coat of primer, I do 2 coats of paint, and 2 coats of lacquer, and that's the process. And my paint, I hold my gun maybe 16 inches away from the surface, and just go back and forth, and I just go down and I go back up, and that gives me the thin layer that I'm looking for, instead of trying to do one thick layer at once. That usually ends up where you get runs. So you want to build thin layers. So at this point I have 2 layers of paint on, and we're getting ready to spray. So now I'm going to take this paper off, and this gives me a little sneak peek at what this is going to look like. And I'm happy with that. So now I'm spraying. I don't know if this is the first coat or the last coat. I think it's the first coat. And I use lacquer. I buy the Watco lacquer from Home Depot. And a lot of people are a little bit hesitant about using it, but I think it gives wood a much more natural look. And so I think it goes really good for a wood top like this. And I think it's just as durable as polyurethane. And each layer you spray will reactivate the previous layers, and then they will all bond together. So we're almost at the finish line here. I'm going to take this dresser out. I'm going to hit the top with 400 and smooth it out and put the drawers in. And then it's going to go over to my staging wall, and that'll be it. And I had my wife come out and stage the dresser for pictures because she keeps up with the latest style and fashion, and I'm a guy, I don't know anything about that. That's it. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for the next one.